one of the other stops on this Rick Steves Heart of France tour, and I'm actually going to attempt to pronounce this, the Chenoneau Chateau. This Loire Valley Chateau spans the River Cher near the small village of Chenoneau. It's the second most visited chateau in France, second only to Versailles itself. The estate that the chateau sits in is first mentioned in writing in the 11th century. The current chateau was built in 1514 to 1522 on the foundations of an old mill, and this was later expanded to span the river. The bridge over the river was built in 1556 to 1559, when the gallery on the bridge was built in 1570 and 76. In the 13th century, the chateau belonged to the Marquis family. But the original chateau was torched in 1412 to punish the owner, Jean Marquis, for an act of sedition. But he rebuilt a chateau and fortified mill on the site in the 1430s. But it was later sold out from the Marquis family by King Charles VIII of France, and he purchased the castle in 1513. But then he demolished most of it except for the keep. He built an entirely new residence between 1520 and 1521. Then, in 1535, the chateau was seized from the new owners by King Francis I for unpaid debts to the crown. I have no idea what that means. But after Francis' death in 1547, Henry II offered the chateau as a gift to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who evidently liked the chateau along the river, so he gave it to her. I guess it's good to be the mistress to the king. In 1555, she was the one who commissioned to build the arched bridge joining the chateau to the opposite bank. Diane then oversaw the planting of the flowers and the vegetable garden, along with a variety of fruit trees set along the banks of the river. This is an amazing working garden, lots of vegetables, which I'm sure kept the mistress in pretty good health for that time. The gardens are open to the public, and they're worth the walk through even if you don't like vegetables. Although Diane was definitely the boss of the castle, the ownership still remained with the crown until 1555. Somehow, through delicate legal maneuvers, Diane actually gained possession of the chateau. Not bad for a mistress, huh? Now, after King Henry died in 1559, his widow, Catherine de' Medici, the Florentine family had their fingers up here in France too, forced Diane to exchange the chateau for a different chateau. Queen Catherine made this chateau her own favorite residence, adding a series of new gardens. But don't feel too bad for Diane. She still ended up with a chateau of her own. Now, Catherine spent a fortune on the chateau and spectacular nighttime parties. In 1560, the first ever fireworks display in France marked the ascension to the throne of Catherine's son Francis II. The Grand Gallery, which extended along the existing bridge to cross the entire river, was dedicated in 1577. Catherine also added rooms between the chapel and the library on the east side, as well as a servants' wing on the west side of the entry courtyard. This is a pretty nice place to walk through. You see the furnishings in it, and you get to see how these women were living. Now, you do notice that it seemed like it was all women that were living here. It doesn't seem like there were ever any men who actually lived here. Now, on Catherine's death in 1589, the chateau went to her daughter-in-law, Louise of Lorraine, who was the wife of King Henry III. Louise was at the chateau when she learned of her husband's assassination in 1589. She then fell into a state of depression and spent the next 11 years in the chateau until her death. She was just wandering aimlessly along the chateau's corridors, dressed in mourning clothes and a lot of black, somber tapestries stitched with skulls and crossbones. So it was probably a pretty depressing place. Then Henry IV obtained the chateau for his mistress. So now there was another woman and another mistress in here. So there have been a lot of women running this household. Now Henry's mistress left it to her 6-year-old niece, who was betrothed to a 4-year-old son of a Bourbon king. You gotta love this stuff. In 1720, another Duke of Bourbon purchased the chateau. It seemed like this particular Duke was more of a corporate raider because he sold off most of the chateau's contents and many of the statues, which ended up in Versailles. In 1733, a financier bought the chateau, and it hosted writers and scientists during the Age of Enlightenment. During the French Revolution, the chateau was spared the destruction of many other royal residences, and that's because it was a central point of travel and commerce, being the only bridge that crossed the river for many miles. So even with mob mentality, somebody kept their head enough to say, this place could actually be worth something. In 1864, a rich heiress acquired the chateau, and in around 1875, she commissioned an architect to restore it. He almost completely renewed the interior and removed several of Catherine Medici's additions and her alterations to the northern facade. There used to be statues of Hercules and Apollo and some others, and they would just move to the park area. With the money she spent on projects and her lavish parties, her finances were also depleted. Seems like this place was a real party place for the women who lived here. The chateau was then seized by the state and then sold. In 1891, a Cuban millionaire acquired the place. Then in 1913, the chateau was bought by Henry Minier of a famous chocolate factory. Now, upon his death, his brother Gaston, a progressive deputy and later senator, transformed the chateau into a military hospital for the duration of the Great War. And they still own it to the day. During the Second World War, the chateau was bombed by the Germans in June of 1940 because it was a means of escape from the Nazi-occupied zone of France on one side of the river Cher to the free zone on the other side of the river. When the chateau became occupied by the Germans, it was getting bombed by the Allies. Then when the Allies started moving into France and they took it over, it was again getting bombed by the Germans. In 1951, the Menier family started the chateau restoration and brought the structures from the ravages of war's time and a flood in 1940 back to what we see today. And we are very glad they did.